All right, today we're going to be reading chapters 15 and 16 of Forbidden Schoolhouse. Chapter 15 is entitled For Sale. The good news kept coming. On September 4th, Samuel May married a very happy William Lloyd Garrison to the dark-haired Ellen Benson. That sentence sounded really funny. It sounded for a second like Samuel May had married a very happy William Lloyd Garrison, but he married a happy William Lloyd Garrison to his sweetheart, Helen Benson. 5 days later in Rhode Island, Sarah Harris Fairweather gave birth to a little girl that she named Prudence Crandall Fairweather. Oh, that's so cool. Her student named her daughter after her. At the school, Prudence's new stepson and stepdaughter settled into their new home. Prudence taught. Calvin preached at a nearby Baptist church. The girls concentrated on their lessons. On September 9, the day that Sarah had her baby, everything seemed to be going smoothly. After a day of work and study, the family and students had dinner, said goodnight and turned out the lights and went to bed. By midnight, the house was quiet. The residents were fast asleep when a blood-curdling screech ripped through the darkness. Screaming men pounded the school doors, walls, and windows with clubs and iron bars. Glass was shattered. Wood splintered. Walls were shaking. Men burst through the door and stormed through the ground floor, smashing furniture and hurling it to the floor. Then it was quiet. When the sun came up, Prudence surveyed the damage. No one was hurt, but 5 window frames had been ripped to pieces. Glass from 90 shattered window panes crunched underfoot, and bits of broken furniture littered the floor. The students were terrified, and one frightened girl was coughing up blood. Prudence was devastated. She had endured prison, legal trials, a fire, a boycott, and months of insults, but this was way too much. She couldn't face her students, so she was really emotionally shook up. She couldn't even face them. It was William Burley, Prudence's assistant teacher, who told the frightened girls that classes had been canceled for the day. Then he left the house and headed for Brooklyn to carry the news to Samuel May. That afternoon, the 2 men returned to Canterbury. Inside the school, a horrified May stared at the wreckage. The front rooms were unusable, the students unnerved. After the fire, May had urged Prudence not to give in. Now, as he looked at the smashed windows and broken furniture, the minister knew now that the situation was hopeless. There was no point in making the repairs. The Canterbury vandals would only come and strike again. This time, the school had been damaged. Next time, someone might seriously be hurt. So they've taken it in their own hands. They've decided to act violently, and all of the things that the townspeople feel that they've been trying to do to get her to stop, it's not stopping her. So now they're reverting to the most evil of things, and that is physical violence. As the bright September sun streamed in through the shattered windows, Prudence and May discussed the problem. There were few alternatives, and finally Prudence asked her good friend to do her one last favor. With a heavy heart, May called the girls together and told them it was time to pack their bags. There was no choice, he said. The school would have to close. It was only the sensible course, but the sad, bitter words almost blistered May's lips as he spoke. I felt ashamed of Canterbury, ashamed of my country, ashamed of my color, the minister later wrote. That's heartbreaking. If you've ever known somebody or experienced this where a school or a family member or a friend or a student or somebody did something that just really is so shocking that it makes you hurt, it makes you ashamed that you had some part in it. Now, May didn't do any of this, but this is his town. These are his neighbors. This is his country. This is his religion, and it is devastating another person. So there's this heartbreak that happens when people that you trusted, people that you believed in, people that you thought you saw things the same as, really demonstrate some very, very hurtful things. And it is heartbreaking. In an essay, one of the students described how the girls said their tearful goodbyes. Despite the abuse and despite the insults and the fears, the pupils cherished their memories and their teacher's kindness. For the girls, the students said the Crandall School had been a place of communion with heaven. There was only one thing left to do. On September 11th, Calvin placed an ad in the Liberator. For sale, it said, the house in Canterbury occupied by Prudence Crandall. By November 15th, the big house had been sold and the family had moved in with Prudence's parents. A few months later, Calvin decided to move his wife and children to a small farm he owned in the upstate of New York. The Canterbury townsfolk probably were not sorry to see them go. Maybe they threw another celebration, right? So awful. On a spring day in 1835, barely 2 years after she'd welcomed her first black pupils, Prudence Crandall Filio boarded the stagecoach that would take her and her family out of Canterbury, Connecticut. As the horse jogged down the familiar roads, Prudence's thoughts may have drifted back over all that had happened since she'd first met Sarah Harris. Since then, she'd lost her school. She'd lost her home. Her plans to educate young black women had collapsed. Of course, she had tried to do something important. She had faced trouble and fought a good fight. But did any of that really matter? As the coach sped down the long road leading out of Canterbury, Prudence probably believed that her enemies had won. There's that devil, right? Seeds of doubt he plants in our heart that, you know what? I really did nothing. I'm really not making a difference. I know for myself, I have definitely felt that before. I felt that before in my own personal life, among my own friends and family, and especially as a teacher. Sometimes certain things come up and you just kind of sit there like, am I really making a difference? And that is always the devil. That is the devil trying to keep you from the mission that God has given you. Chapter 16, Deep Convictions of Right. 15 years passed. All right, we just jumped a lot here. 14 new states were admitted into the Union. 16 different presidents had sat in the White House. For 4 long, bloody years between 1861 and 1865, the Civil War had torn at the heart of the nation. So now we've jumped all the way past the Civil War. This was in 1830s. 40s, 50s, 60s, right, is the Civil War. Now we're probably in about the 1870s. In 1865, slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. 3 years later, the 14th Amendment, which stated, get this, that blacks were U.S. citizens. Praise the Lord. It was added to the U.S. Constitution. Then in 1869, another amendment, the 15th Amendment, gave African American men the right to vote. Little by little, the country was changing. Railroad men laid a shining ribbon of track across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Blue Pacific. Elias Howe made the first sewing machine. Thomas Edison invented the electric light. It's a little debatable whether it was just him. But in 1886, a newspaper reporter named George Thayer decided to travel from Hartford, Connecticut to San Francisco on a newfangled machine they called a bicycle. Whoa, he's going to travel across the country on a bike, all right, from Connecticut to San Francisco. Along the way, he said he planned to interview interesting people. One of them he decided to interview was Prudence Crandall. He found her living in Texas, in a little prairie town called Elk Falls. She was at this time 84 years old. All right, so this has been a while. She's seen a lot that has gone on during this time. She's moved from Connecticut to New York and now out to Kansas. A thin, stooped, almost toothless woman in a shabby black cotton dress. Her short gray hair was cropped off just below her ears, and 2 bright blue eyes sparkled in her wrinkled face. I'm glad to see anyone from good old Connecticut, she told Thayer in a pleasant voice. You must be hungry, coming so far. She sat him down by the fire and stuffed him full of ham, potatoes, bread and butter, ginger snaps, tea, and some apple pie. Then, when Thayer had swallowed the last mouthful, the old lady pulled up a rocking chair by his side and began to talk about her adventures. I want to show some pictures real fast here. We've got this picture, the passage of the 15th Amendment. It's in celebration of African Americans getting the right to vote. And then we have Petals and Path. Petal and Path. So that's his advertisement for him traveling across the country. Her mother, father, brothers, and sisters had all died. So just like Maricha, she outlived everyone in her family. Her own life had been very difficult, and her marriage had become a disaster. All right, so what we looked at is those kind of red flags, those warnings from her friends, turned out to be very true. Soon after the wedding, Calvin began to show signs of mental illness. He began having seizures, and he lost his memory. Sometimes he behaved like a helpless child. At other times, he bullied his family. He ordered Prudence around, and he refused to let her read certain books. and frittered away his small income on crazy deals and investments. Prudence had no time to work with abolitionists, and she couldn't teach black children. She had to take care of her husband. She brought up Calvin's son. She tended his sickly daughter until the girl died. But by 1842, Prudence had reached the end of her patience with the man. She was 49 years old, so that was 9 years later, and she wanted to start a new life. Her stepchildren no longer needed her care. Her daughter had died, and her son was being successful. Her husband was intolerable and probably demented, which means kind of that you can't remember, right? Dementia is that you can't remember things. It could be insanity. Divorce was expensive and difficult. Divorce laws favored men, and in the 1800s, most people thought dissolving a marriage was sinful and scandalous. For Prudence, though, there was only one way to escape. She packed a bag, left her husband, and headed out to Illinois to set up a farm on some land that her family owned. With only her 13-year-old nephew to help, Prudence sowed oats and put up fences. She piled dung on potato plants to keep them from freezing, and she began to build a house. This woman is crazy, right? Now she's going to go start a farm on her own. The farm did well. Calvin did not. He needed care, and Prudence felt that she had to help. After only 2 years in Illinois, she traveled back to the East Coast to nurse her husband, so she must have felt guilty about leaving him. To make a living, Prudence then began to teach classes for black adults, many of whom had once been slaves. Teaching, however, did not pay the bills. Then as in now. Prudence was soon down to her last few dollars. Luckily, her nephew, Obadiah, had kept up the farm in Illinois, and Prudence knew that she was welcome there. She invited Calvin to then head west with her. When he couldn't make up his mind, she hopped on a canal boat and headed back to Illinois without him. Here's a picture of her farm in Elk Falls. For the next few years, Prudence ran a prairie school and continued to work for abolitionists. As the Union and Confederate armies clashed out on the battlefields, neighbors saw her standing in the street, dressed in trousers, with an overcoat on, passing out anti-slavery pamphlets. This lady is awesome. Scandalous already just even we wearing trousers, right? Like women in the 1800s didn't wear pants. So this lady is something else, man. But no matter where Prudence went or what she did, there was always Calvin. He was useless, ornery, and undoubtedly insane. But still, when he came west and needed help, once again, Prudence took him in. Instead, though, of being grateful, Calvin began to upset the household again. He abused the animals. He called his wife Old Squash Head. He drove Prudence crazy with his endless prayers. And finally, he died on January 5th, 1874. Ooh, we see an author's bias here, don't we? When it says, and finally he died. So the author definitely feels some frustration towards Prudence in the research that she has done. It was time for a fresh start, and when Prudence's brother Hezekiah came west, she settled down with him on some land near Elk Falls, Kansas. Prudence likes Kansas. The farm prospered and life was good. Then, in the bitter winter of 1881, Hezekiah suddenly died of pneumonia. Prudence grieved, but went on. This woman has lost everybody. While a young man took care of the farm chores, 78-year-old Prudence began to work for her favorite cause. 78, all right? In a time when people didn't live past, their 60s. When former slaves flooded into Kansas after the Civil War to escape harsh treatment in the South, she supported efforts to help these struggling African Americans. In Elk Falls, Prudence organized temperance festivals. So remember the abolition of alcohol and the abstinence from drinking. To teach children about the dangers of alcohol. So she's starting one of those early DARE movements, teaching kids to stay away from alcohol. She campaigned for women's rights and for world peace. I am earnestly engaged, she said, in every reform for the good of the human race, Prudence told a reporter from the Topeka Daily Capital. Besides, she added, I hope to live long enough to see a college built on this farm into which can be admitted all classes of the human family without regard to sex or color. This woman is fighting for education. She's fighting for African American rights. She's fighting for women's rights. She's fighting against temperance or for temperance and against alcohol. She's fighting for world peace. Miss America, right? This is incredible. Her mind was sharp. Her days were long and busy. She had no money. Her home was a little run-down, book-filled shack on the Kansas prairie, almost 2 miles from her nearest neighbor. But if Prudence had regrets, she never talked about them. The past was the past. She seemed to only be looking towards the future. What a powerful, inspirational woman. Certainly, in 1885, at the age of 83, the very last thing she probably expected was a message from Canterbury, Connecticut. Okay, remember she left Canterbury when she was in her 40s. Now she's in her 80s. It's been 40 years, and she gets a message back from them. 50 years after her school had closed, the town had decided to apologize. Now, a lot of these people would have been the children of those people that had hurt her, but they're still very, very powerful. 112 Canterbury citizens had signed a petition asking the Connecticut state legislature to clear Prudence's name and repay her for the financial losses that she had suffered when her school was forced to close. So the next generation really, or maybe 2 generations later, really took it upon themselves to forgive, or to ask for forgiveness, but to undo the wrongs that their elders had done. So that's very, very powerful and very telling of their character and the change that had taken place in the United States in that time. Times had changed. Canterbury had learned a lesson, and many Connecticut residents were ashamed of the way that they and their families had treated Prudence and her African American students. Philip Pearl, one of the authors of the infamous Black Law that Prudence had broken, told a friend that he could weep tears of blood for his part in the attack on Mrs. Crandall and her school. The Black Law, he confessed, was utterly abominable. So he's very repentant. Okay, so we talked earlier about how those people who had signed those petitions, those people who had done these terrible things, they're going to have to answer to that. But some of them answered to it earlier. Some of them asked for forgiveness of Prudence and hopefully of God for their part in that. And it looks here that some of them were very repentant of their sins, which we serve a mighty God who forgives us for those things. And Prudence will do so as well. Others shared his feelings. In 1838, the Connecticut legislature struck down the Black Law and made it possible for African American students from all over the United States to go to school in Connecticut. In the years between 1838 and the start of the Civil War in 1861, anti-slavery societies flourished in Connecticut, and the state became an important stop on the Underground Railroad. In Windham County, where people had once hurled rotten eggs at Prudence's students, 13 agents regularly helped runaway slaves to freedom. Maybe it was her influence that caused them to decide to do that. Later, in 1868, Connecticut became one of the first states to ratify or approve the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that officially made African Americans full-fledged citizens of the United States. Isn't that awesome? So her old state, where she had done so much work, was one of the first states to approve the 14th Amendment. Attitudes towards blacks had altered, but they hadn't changed completely. In 1885, when the Canterbury townsfolk presented their petition, the Connecticut legislature did not rush to send money or apologize to Prudence. Some lawmakers claimed that they didn't feel obliged to do anything for Miss Crandall because she had once broken a Connecticut state law, but others had an entirely different view. At a meeting of the legislature, Senator John W. Marvin begged his fellow Connecticut lawmakers to help Prudence. "Our heroine still lives," Marvin told them. "She can know and appreciate our acts in her behalf. If this General Assembly shall even in part right this great wrong, that she will go down to her grave, not only in peace, but with gratitude to her native state." Marvin was not alone, and as the weeks went by, support mounted. The son of the Canterbury sheriff who had once arrested Prudence campaigned for her. One of Andrew Judson's relatives asked the legislator to help Prudence. Wow, so even her own earlier enemies, their children, are asking for this. Mark Twain, the famous author of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, tried to persuade well-wishers to buy back Prudence's original Canterbury house so she could always have a home to live in. Even newspapers took to her side. One, the Springfield Republican, said bluntly, she was right in teaching the Negro children. Mark Twain, if you're not familiar with his face, there he is, very, very famous American author. Prudence herself had mixed emotions. She didn't want people to feel sorry for her, but she didn't feel the state of Connecticut owed her some compensation for her financial losses and suffering. When a reporter from the Topeka Daily Capital asked her how she felt, Prudence explained matters simply. "I do not consider that I am an object of charity," she said, "but I do ask the Connecticut legislature to pay me a little part of just debt that I feel that they are duty-bound to pay." So this woman is respectful and kind and appreciative, even to the end. She says, "Yeah, they owe me a little bit for what they have done, but they don't owe me what they think they owe me because I did what was right, and that's enough for me." Finally, on April 2nd, 1886, Prudence received a telegram. It said that the legislature had voted to grant her a pension of $400 a year until her death. When reporter George Thayer asked how she felt about that, Prudence replied, "If the people of Connecticut only knew how happy I am, it would make them happy too." So she was happy by their apology and what they tried to do for her. With the pension money, Prudence bought a decent 2-story house in Elk Falls. She was 84 years old. She had plenty of energy and she wanted to work. 84 years old is old today. It was super old then. This is just incredible. Neighbors soon got used. This is amazing. Neighbors soon got used to seeing a bent old lady dressed in black marching down the street with a white cheesecloth peace flag slung over her shoulder. It was Prudence, on her way to lecture on the evils of war or on the importance of women's rights in the local schoolhouse or in the meeting hall. What an inspiring woman. Prudence was famous, but it didn't change the way she lived. At 85, she was still a fighter. Money didn't interest her, but new things did. She ate up books. She even read about Charles Darwin's controversial new theory that said that all creatures, including humans, had gradually evolved from primitive, one-celled animals. Of course, today we know that as evolution. Still, age began to take its toll on her. At 86, age began to take its toll. At 86, Prudence began to have trouble breathing. Something seemed to be wrong with her lungs, but she didn't want to give in to it. "Mind has great power over matter, and I think I can drive away this disease," she said. What a great lady. But this time, willpower was not enough. In January of 1890, Prudence knew that she was dying. When her friend, the Reverend McKesson, asked what he should preach in her funeral sermon, the old lady answered simply, "Preach the truth." And later she added, "I am no more afraid to die than I am to live." There was little more to say. A few days later, on the morning of January 28th, Prudence quietly passed away. They buried her in the Elk Falls Cemetery, and the Reverend McKesson spoke at her grave. "She was a great woman," he said, "and she had deep convictions of right, and neither death, life, angels, demons, or principalities, nor any other creature could keep her from following her convictions." Wow. What a woman. Are you not just so inspired by her? I just absolutely love this. I love this. Nothing could stop her. It reminds me so much of the quote we looked at the other day. "Though the heavens may fall, she stood for what was right." Literally, though the heavens should fall. Nothing, right? The Bible tells us that too. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. Also, there is nothing that we can't do without him. All right, that is the end of our chapters. We'll be looking tomorrow at the epilogue because in informational nonfiction text, we always want to do that. So we're going to look at the epilogue and we will look at the students and where they ended up being in the end. But I want you to really think about the end of Prudence's life here. She's very inspiring, and I think she lived very much by one of her great mottos that she says at the end of her life. "Mind has great power over matter, and I think I can drive this away." Do you agree that mind has a lot to do? The attitude you have in your mind has a lot to do with how successful you will be. The whole idea of mind over matter. This is difficult, but if you set your mind to it, if you have that growth mindset, you'll be able to complete it. And finally, I want you to think about how at the end of her life, she says, "I am no more afraid to die than I am to live? Is this not the motto, the belief as a Christian, the security as a Christian that we want to have ourselves? So be thinking about those. And I have one last question for you to answer on that. And thank you guys so much for reading this book with me and following Prudence's story.